Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we'll be doing another piece of Irish history with the Easter Rising. All of these topics are recommended by the same person, and honestly I was going to do stuff about Desmond Doss without this stuff, which I bet you've heard a million times, but a lot of people don't know Irish history. I'm one of them. I don't know much about Irish history, but I've always wanted to learn it, so I'm also learning with you. And in these videos I'm trying to be as unbiased as possible, which is quite hard given that I'm from the UK and so on. And yeah, let's get on with the video.
Since medieval times, Ireland had been under English rule. Many wars and rebellions from the Gaelic Irish were fought, but England steadily grew in power. Since 1297, there was a British Parliament in Ireland, which sort of took care of Irish business, but as Republican ideals spread from the American and French revolutions, Theobald Wolfe-Tone of the United Irishmen led a rebellion in 1798 to create an Irish Republic, but they failed. After this, Parliament was taken away from Ireland and
They failed several times, actually.
Ruled directly from London, leading to Ireland being hugely neglected when the potato crops failed year after year in the late 1840s, and the Irish were forced to sell their other crops. Millions of people died of starvation and disease, while millions...
Which I've also done, the Irish potato famine. I highly recommend that video. Most people don't know much about the Irish potato famine, so yes.
More left Ireland, never to return. Throughout the 19th century, support was growing for Home Rule, Ireland to be ruled from Dublin once more. This coincided with a huge cultural movement, the Gaelic Revival, in which Irish music, language and sports were growing back in popularity. The Republican movement had received a tricolour from France in 1848, symbolising a Republic of Ireland, peace between its people, Catholic and Protestant. An underground Republican
Which is still debatable to this day.
Movement, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, also began to make moves. Not everyone in Ireland supported Home Rule, however. The north of Ireland, Ulster, had been predominantly Protestant since the Ulster plantations in the 17th century. Industry was going strong for them, and they strongly supported the union with Britain. They believed Home Rule would result in Ireland being controlled by the Catholic Church. They promised to fight if Ireland got Home Rule. Both sides armed themselves, forming the Ulster Volunteers and the Irish Volunteers. A young poet and teacher named Patrick Pearse moved up the ranks of the Irish Volunteers and joined the IRB. He was inspired by the mythological hero Cuchulainn and Irish Republican heroes Wolfe-Tone and Robert Emmet, all of whom died in the defence of their ideals. The Dublin
Yeah, well, Ireland has a lot of people like this.
Lockout of 1913 saw socialist leader James Connolly come to prominence in setting up the Citizens' Army in Dublin to protect the workers on strike. In 1914, Home Rule was voted into Parliament, but an Austro-Hungarian Archduke was shot in Sarajevo, sparking off the First World War. Home Rule was put on hold till after the war. There was a split in the Irish Volunteers. Some believed they should go off and fight for the freedom of small nations and come back as a fully trained army for Ireland. Others, such as Thomas Clarke, believed that now was the time to strike while Britain was...
Yeah, this was one of the problems that was here, was the fact that this happened during a world war, which meant that actually Britain was much weaker at this point, but as an actual country, but stronger as in their people. So that's how a lot of this was kicked off.
Distracted by the war in Europe. In 1915, at the funeral of Fenian leader Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, Patrick Pearse gave a rousing speech of how Ireland unfree will never be at peace. The older Fenian leaders chose him to speak, as he represented the new, younger generation of Irish republicanism. Connolly thought that the Irish Volunteers weren't concerned with the working people, and he even threatened to send his Citizens' Army up against the British in 1960.
Which we saw in the Troubles, which I've also done a video on. We saw basically a civil war kind of a civil war almost.
The IRB swooped in, talked him down and coaxed him into joining them as they continued their plans. The Irish Women's Council, Cumann na mBan, who were akin to the suffragette movement, were also brought into the fray. The plan for the rising was for regiments of Irish volunteers to parade on Easter Sunday throughout the country. A totally acceptable cover story for the British, but once in place, they would capture strategic spots and hold the country, forcing Britain to relinquish control while it fought in the trenches. All of this was kept secret from Owen McNeill, the leader of the Irish Volunteers, who thought it was crazy to go up against the highly trained, highly armed British Army.
Oh, I'm not surprised. The British Army at this point, and still now, is one of the strongest armies in the world. And with Ireland and with Ireland being made up of mostly volunteers and not much training, it would mean that it would have been a complete disaster if only this wasn't part of a long war. Seen as actually, with Britain being part of World War One, they had no proper army at home. They were volunteer armies, which meant that actually they were in very similar positions.
Hobson, who was against the rising, was kidnapped on Good Friday and held until the rising got underway. McNeill was all set to call off the rising, but was told about the IRB securing weapons from Germany. But the German ship carrying the weapons was captured before it could land. When McNeill found out, he sent a countermanding order throughout the country, stopping volunteers from doing anything on Easter Sunday. The IRB leaders decided to go ahead with the rising on Easter Monday at noon, but it was difficult to send word out to the rest of the country at such short notice. The conflict thusly would be mainly centred around Dublin. They drafted and signed the Proclamation of Independence, proclaiming an Irish Republic with Patrick Pearse as its president.
Just like with what the USA did, without the USA doing it without actually conferring with the other side properly.
Easter Monday came and the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizens' Army gathered at Liberty Hall and marched on Sackville Street. Their target was the General Post Office, which would be their main headquarters, cutting off
which was also one of the most important buildings in Dublin at this point, and how actually without this building they wouldn't be able to do a lot of things the British wouldn't be able to. So it meant that actually it was a very strategic option to pick this building.
Main station of wireless communication. They captured the GPO and Pearse stepped out in front and read the proclamation, declaring the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland. At this time, many people didn't know what was going on. Many Irish people were quite happy with the status quo of being part of Britain. As far as they were concerned, the fighting should be happening out in France. The battalions were sent to various strategic buildings in the city to try and hold the city centre for as long as possible. An attempt was made to capture Dublin Castle, the British headquarters in Ireland. It was here the first shot was fired and the unarmed Constable O'Brien was shot dead. The castle gates were closed.
Yep, and that was the first death of the Rising, as it says, but it also meant that actually this is how a conflict starts.
And the rebels fell back to the adjoining city, despite Dublin Castle being painfully undermanned at the start of the rising. None of the major train stations or ports were captured, which allowed for the eventual arrival of British reinforcements.
This, with them not actually capturing the major points, the transport points, meant that actually it seemed like a massive failure, because if the British reinforcements could come in, it meant that actually they would lose almost instantly because of that.
The Dubliners themselves, who lived in some of the poorest conditions in Europe, began looting the shops. Martial law was declared and Brigadier General Lowe took charge of the forces in Dublin. When he arrived, there were just over 1,000 British troops in Dublin. He housed the troops in Trinity College and set up artillery aimed at the rebels. British forces set up barricades out of anything they could find throughout the streets to prevent the movement of Irish troops.
Which is very similar to in New Orleans when that was given to the Spanish and French. They would literally put up massive barricades, and actually this meant that a lot of things were destroyed, but it meant that it was almost like the trenches where you have big long walls to shoot from.
They relied heavily on artillery bombardment rather than direct assaults, giving the rebels nothing to shoot at. Messages were sent between the Irish forces via little boys and women on bikes. Francis Sheehy Skeffington, a pacifist trying to stop looters, was arrested by the British and executed the next morning for no apparent reason. Late Tuesday night, British reinforcements landed at Kingstown Harbour and on Wednesday began to march in the city centre. As they walked past the RDS, they were applauded by Dublin civilians, but things changed as they approached the Grand Canal.
So that was a very famous moment, because we all think, in the UK at least, that when this happened, the British troops were not accepted and were harassed. Well, actually, the Irish at this point didn't really have anything to complain about too much, really, especially with the ongoing war. Yes, they'd had some run-ins with the British which were less than favourable, but at this point most of the opinions were that they were saving Ireland from being controlled by the Germans, who everyone who most people in Ireland agreed were bad, and at this point, yeah, some of the Irish hated him, but most of them didn't, especially in Dublin.
Eamon de Valera had captured Boland's Mill, and his soldiers had taken up positions aimed at Mount Street Bridge. The British soldiers marched endlessly into the line of fire as the bodies piled up until the volunteers were out of ammo, and the British eventually got grenades. The British gunboat Helga came up the Liffey and demolished Liberty Hall. On Thursday, while seeing to the troops in front of the GPO, James Connolly was hit in the leg by a ricocheting bullet. He was unable to walk for the rest of the rising. Along North King Street, while trying to advance against rebel positions, British soldiers burrowed through civilian houses, killing a few accused of being rebels. General Sir John Maxwell was sent from London with reinforcements. By Friday, there were over 16,000 British soldiers in Dublin.
This is where most of the hatred comes from, this rising, because of the amount of carnage that was caused by the British.
Sackville Street was ablaze from all the shelling. As the flames closed in on the GPO, Pearse called a retreat to the Williams and Wood factory on King's Inn Street, but they became entrenched in the buildings of Moore Street. During the retreat, the O'Rahilly was shot dead, the only rising leader to be killed during the fighting. The centre of Dublin had been greatly destroyed, the first European city since the Napoleonic Wars to suffer such destruction. Many innocent civilians were...
Well, and then you had areas in Germany from bombings, but again, yeah, this was one of the worst periods of time for Ireland with the British, almost ever. The British were honestly absolutely horrible to the Irish up to this point, but this just kind of cemented the hatred.
Caught up in the attacks and killed. The civilian casualties during the rising was much greater than military casualties. As the civilian death toll rose, Pearse and Connolly decided to surrender. Nurse Elizabeth O'Farrell was sent out with a white flag. Pearse then officially surrendered to General Lowe. The message spread, and the other Irish battalions around the city stood down. As the women of Command Naman surrendered, some British authorities said that they could just go home. The women insisted on being arrested with their Irish brothers in arms. The courts-martial for the leaders would be in Richmond Barracks under General Blackadder. Yes, that was actually his name. Maxwell thought that he would make an example of them and sentenced them to death. The executions began on May 3rd in Kilmainham Jail and continued into the following week. Pearse was executed on the first day, Connolly on the last.
Yeah, lots of people were killed and executed for this.
Some leaders avoided
This had lasted over a month at this point.
Execution.
Or a month. Yeah, just under a month so far.
Eamon de Valera, as he was born in the United States, Constance Markovich, because she was a woman. As the executions rang on, the public began to see these troublemakers become martyrs. They were dying for something, an Irish Republic. British Prime Minister H.H. Asquith arrived in Dublin, concerned at the rate of the executions so soon after the rebellion, and called a stop to further executions. In Cork, Thomas Kent, a volunteer officer who had stayed at home, was executed. Roger Casement, who negotiated with the Germans, would be executed in England later that year.
Now, the reason that Robert Casement was arrested and executed wasn't actually because of being part of the Irish Rebellion, while that probably did have something to do with it, but people weren't able to be executed because of that anymore. It was actually because of conferring the Germans to destroy the British. Therefore, it was actually a heavier toll of treason by trying to take over using the Germans. And this is one of the reasons why actually the Irish are still not very welcome in the UK. It's because of the fact that you have to think everyone thinks that they had committed a large treason, and they had.
Treason.
Well, somewhat, according to law anyway. But I'm trying to be as unbiased as possible.
When Irish soldiers returned from the war in Europe, they returned to a changed Ireland. They expected a hero's welcome, but they were shunned for fighting for the British. In the following years, Sinn Féin would rise in power and would win a landslide victory in the elections of 1919. These elected officials would sit in Dáil Éireann, the new self-proclaimed Irish government. The men and women of the rising who survived would go on to lead Ireland to ultimate independence, but not before a brutal civil war. The Protestants of 6 counties in the north of Ireland would opt out of the Irish Free State and become what is now Northern Ireland. By the time Eamon de Valera came into power in the 1930s and had a new Irish constitution drafted, he
Yes.
allowed the Catholic Church to have a lot of influence within the constitution and the state itself. And that turned out very well. The statue of Cuchulainn stands in the GPO today, the warrior who died defending his homeland against all odds. It symbolises the men and women who stood up to the might of the British Empire. The legacy of the Rising lies in the republic we now have today.
And actually, without that Rising, we probably wouldn't have the Republic of Ireland anymore.
Some wonder if the republic
Any at all.
resembles the independence proclaimed by the Rising leaders a century ago. What do you think? Coming to a theatre near you very soon, as long as you're in Ireland. McKagan and O'Brien present The Rising, and by ways of interlude...
Anyway, it's the end of the video, so remember to like, subscribe and all that. And I'll see you in the next one, you know. Thank you for the person who keeps recommending me these events. Honestly, it's brilliant. And I would not have learned all of this unless for this. And honestly, you are probably one of my best supporters. Anyway, and I still can't believe I met you because I just commented on a video. It's very unusual that. Anyway, thanks again, all of you. Thank you for the 2,000 views, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.